Empires do not fall because of earthquakes or revolutions alone. They falter the moment they fail to notice the smallest child in the corner of the room. On that December morning, in the marbled lobby of Cedar Line Tower, 12-year-old James Brooks, boots muddy from a forgotten farm and sweater frayed to threads, was the invisible hinge on which a billion-dollar empire would turn. The lobby of Cedar Line Tower smelled faintly of lemon polish and ambition. A 20-story wall of glass opened toward the winter sky, catching the pale sun and scattering it across the polished marble floor. Executives in dark suits moved briskly, their voices clipped, their shoes echoing like steady drum beats in a temple of wealth. Their badges flashed gold against navy blazers. Their scarves smelled of new wool, and the rhythm of their conversation was a language James had never been invited to speak. In the farthest corner, half hidden behind a column of travertine, sat a boy whose boots were caked with red earth from Red Ridge County. James Brooks had been dropped off here at dawn when his mother began her shift. His sweater, once navy, had faded to a weary gray. The elbows bore neat little patches she had sewn from old pillowcases. His small hands clutched a composition notebook, the kind with a black and white marbled cover, filled not with arithmetic homework or farm chores, but with rows of symbols that looked strange to anyone else, the angular gestures of American Sign Language, and beside them, the rounded marks of Libras, the sign language of Brazil. To James, these pages were a secret map, a world he had been building in silence. His mother, Janelle Brooks, worked nights as a janitor in the building. She wore her uniform with quiet dignity, though her shoulders carried the ache of scrubbing floors no one noticed. She had told him to wait in the lobby until her break, promising she would bring a sandwich and maybe an apple. "Don't talk to anyone, sweetheart," she had said, brushing his hair down with rough, hurried fingers. "Just sit quiet and read." James did as he was told. He always did. From his corner he watched the endless procession of people who did not see him. Their world gleamed with touchscreen tablets and tailored coats. His world was the silence between footsteps, the scratch of his pencil against paper, and the faint hum of the heater that reminded him of the wood stove back home. He was 12, but his eyes carried the weight of someone twice his age. At 8:47 a.m., the first collision happened. A man with shoulders like an armored car strode across the lobby. His tie was crimson silk, and his jaw looked sharpened on ambition. This was Richard Pike, Vice President of Operations. Pike's glance swept the room with the authority of someone who believed he owned the air itself. He saw the boy. "Hey!" Pike's voice cracked like a whip. What are you doing here?" James startled, hugging his notebook to his chest. "I'm waiting for my mom, sir." "Your mom?" Pike's lip curled. He recognized the surname from the roster of janitorial staff. "This is not a daycare. You don't belong here." "I'm quiet," James whispered. "I'm not." But Pike cut him off, voice rising for the benefit of the surrounding staff. "This is Cedar Line Tower, not some barn in Red Ridge County. We run billion-dollar contracts here, not a place for farm boys with mud on their shoes." The words landed heavier than the polished marble floor beneath them. A receptionist looked away. A security guard pretended to adjust his radio. No one spoke for the boy. James lowered his eyes, cheeks burning. His arms tightened around his notebook, the single possession that mattered to him. Inside it lay the gestures he had copied from library books, the movements he had practiced in the cracked mirror above their sink at home, the fragments of Libras he had learned from two seasonal workers who once helped his uncle harvest soybeans. It was not homework. It was his secret cathedral. And yet here he was, told he was nothing more than dirt on his boots. He thought of his mother upstairs, bent over a mop, unaware of the humiliation unraveling below. He thought of Red Ridge County, where winter stripped the soil bare and silence spread across the empty barns. He thought of the voices he could never quite join, voices too fast, too smooth, too polished. A lump formed in his throat, but James did not cry. He had learned early that tears gave people like Pike more reasons to dismiss him. Instead, he held on tighter to his notebook, its cover soft from use. The marble columns seemed taller now, the ceiling higher, the world more unreachable. Still, he did not move. Minutes stretched. The lobby bustled again, conversations resuming as if the small outburst had never happened. Pike, satisfied with his display of authority, strode toward the elevators without looking back. James exhaled slowly, trying to steady his trembling hands. He opened the notebook to a random page. The symbols greeted him like old friends. A drawn hand sweeping across the chest. Sorry. A fist near the chin. Mother. 2 fingers tapping. Wait. He traced them with his finger, silently rehearsing, like prayers he was too shy to say aloud. In the margins, he had scribbled translations into shaky Portuguese. Respeto, respect. Paciencia, patience. Terra, earth. The farm workers had laughed kindly at his accent, but encouraged him nonetheless. Knowledge is soil, one had said, shaping the words slowly so he could follow. Plant it anywhere, and it grows. James believed them. He believed, against all evidence, that silence could grow into something powerful. That morning, however, he remained unseen. Executives swiped their badges. Security scanned deliveries. Receptionists smiled their professional smiles. And in the corner, the boy with mud-stained boots sat invisible, his world colliding with theirs only through insult. Yet, something lingered. Pike's words had left not only a bruise, but also a spark. For every sneer that called him farm boy, James felt the stubborn stirring of defiance. He was used to storms tearing through fields, to crops lost in floods, to nights spent by candlelight when the power bill could not be paid. He knew survival was not polished. It was patched sweaters, second-hand boots, and learning a language no one expected a boy like him to know. And so, while the empire above him busied itself with charts and contracts, James Brooks remained in the lobby, invisible, but watching. He listened to the cadence of hurried voices, the rhythm of shoes on marble, the sigh of the elevator doors. Each sound folded into his memory like the lines of a poem. What no one in that glittering lobby realized, not Pike, not the security guard, not even his mother mopping upstairs, was that the boy sitting silently with his notebook was not merely waiting. He was preparing. The clock ticked toward 9. Upstairs, the 32nd floor was being polished for a meeting that would decide the fate of a $2.4 billion contract. Executives rehearsed speeches, assistants checked translations, and somewhere on I-95, a professional interpreter sat stuck in traffic, honking in frustration. Down below, in the lobby, the farm boy from Redridge County turned a page in his notebook, mouthing a phrase in Libras he had practiced the night before. Purpose first. The boy smiled faintly. He did not yet know it, but before the day was over, the silence he carried would become the loudest voice in Cedar Line Tower. The 32nd floor of Cedar Line Tower gleamed as if it were built for history itself. The long mahogany table stretched the length of the room, polished until the overhead lights rippled like water across its surface. Beside each leather chair sat a pitcher of sparkling water, a notepad, and a pen whose weight alone could have purchased a week's groceries back in Redridge County. Executives circled nervously. Assistants whispered. A digital clock on the far wall ticked toward 9 o'clock. The contract, a sprawling $2.4 billion partnership, waited like an uncut diamond in the middle of the table. At the head of the room stood Catherine Vale, Chief Executive Officer. Her presence was calm but unyielding, like a conductor preparing to raise the baton before a symphony. She adjusted her glasses, checked the briefing folder once more, and then turned toward the receptionist standing anxiously near the door. "Elena," Catherine asked quietly, "is the interpreter here?" Elena's face drained of color. "Ma'am, I just received a call. The interpreter is stuck on I-95. There's a pileup, multiple lanes blocked. They said it could be over an hour." The whisper spread like fire down the length of the table. An hour. The investors were scheduled to arrive in less than 5 minutes. There was no second interpreter. Contracts of this scale did not wait for traffic. "An hour?" Catherine repeated, her voice calm but edged. "We don't have an hour." Papers rustled. Phones buzzed with frantic text messages. At 9:02, the double doors opened. "Dr. Balti." Rafael Morera entered with the confident gait of a man who had built empires not from walls of steel, but from seeds and soil. He was in his mid-40s, tall, with streaks of gray at his temples. His suit was understated, tailored in the quiet elegance of Sao Paulo's financial district. But it was not his attire that commanded the room. It was the presence of a man who had spent decades listening to what others ignored, the silence of farmers, the unspoken language of the land, and the hands of workers who signed their stories rather than spoke them. Dr. Morera had been deaf since early childhood. By his side walked 2 aides, but neither of them was a professional interpreter. They carried binders of technical documents, but no means to bridge the chasm of language that now opened across the table. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room with sharp, patient eyes. And then, when no sign language greeted him, his brow furrowed. His hands moved quickly. "Where is the interpreter?" A silence thicker than marble filled the room. Executives glanced at one another. A few tried to gesture clumsily, but their hands only carved the air without meaning. Elena swallowed hard. She stepped forward, attempting to shape the words she barely remembered from a training pamphlet. Interpreter. Traffic. Late. Her gestures were broken, like fragments of a bridge leading nowhere. Dr. Morera's jaw tightened. His hands moved again, faster, sharper. "This is unacceptable. You knew this meeting mattered." The aides glanced down at their papers, helpless. The executives exchanged worried glances. A $2.4 billion contract teetered on the edge of collapse, not because of hostile negotiations, but because silence had not been respected. Downstairs in the lobby, James Brooks sat unaware of the storm rising above him. He had traced another row of signs into his notebook, mouthing each one carefully. His world was small, just him, the notebook, and the echoes of people rushing past. But through the open atrium he caught snippets of words from a passing assistant, spoken into a phone with urgent breath. "Interpreter stuck on I-95. Meeting can't proceed." James froze. The word hit him like a chord he knew too well. Interpreter. He leaned forward, straining to hear more, but the voice disappeared into the crowd. His heart thudded. The lines in his notebook seemed to shift under his fingertips. Interpreter. Meeting. Can't proceed. Upstairs, someone needed a bridge. Meanwhile, back in the boardroom, Catherine Vale stood at the head of the table, the weight of decades pressing down on her shoulders. She had built her reputation on precision, never a missed figure, never an overlooked clause. But she knew contracts did not rise or fall on numbers alone. They rose or fell on trust, and trust was bleeding away with every passing second of silence. She leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. She spoke slowly, knowing her words would be relayed through no one, reaching no one. "Dr. Morera, please, if you would grant us a brief recess, we can—" But the Brazilian investor shook his head, lifting his hand in a firm motion. His aide scribbled a note on a pad and slid it across the table. "He says, Respect delayed is respect denied. The words burned deeper than any financial clause. Down in the lobby, James turned a page. His finger paused on a scrawled phrase. Proposito primero. Purpose first. He had written it the night before, copying carefully from a Brazilian website that offered bilingual resources. He had stared at that phrase for nearly an hour, testing its rhythm in his hands, wondering how a boy in Redridge could possibly need to say something so big. Now the words pulsed in his mind with sudden clarity. Interpreter. Meeting. Purpose first. James looked up at the towering elevator banks. Executives hurried past, their phones pressed to their ears. Not one of them noticed the boy with the patched sweater. His stomach clenched with the memory of Pike's sneer. Not a place for farm boys with mud on their shoes. And yet, what if the silence upstairs was something only he could break? The clock ticked to 9:15. Moreira sat with arms crossed, his hands still, his patience thinning. He had weathered many failed negotiations before, but rarely one that collapsed before it began. Pike leaned in toward Catherine, lowering his voice but not enough to hide the disdain. If Vale had prepared properly, this wouldn't be happening. We can't bow to unreasonable demands. He'll wait if he wants our billions. Catherine shot him a glance colder than the glass windows overlooking the city. You don't build partnerships by making people wait in silence. But even she knew the truth. Words without an interpreter were only air. And so, in that moment, the empire trembled. Not from markets, not from storms, but from a silence no one knew how to cross. Meanwhile, in the lobby below, James Brooks stood. He pressed the notebook to his chest, heart pounding. His boots left faint traces of red ridge soil on the marble as he took one step toward the elevators, then another. No one noticed. No one except the silence itself. Waiting. The elevator hummed as it climbed. Inside, James Brooks stood on tiptoe, clutching the railing, his notebook pressed tightly to his chest. His patched sweater smelled faintly of wood smoke from the stove back in Redridge. Each floor the numbers glowed brighter. 18, 19, 20. His mind raced faster than the lift. He saw Pike's sneer, heard the word farm boy echo like a gavel striking. He heard his mother's voice, too. Stay quiet, James, don't cause trouble. But silence upstairs was already causing trouble, the kind that cost more than any boy's mistake ever could. He whispered to himself, testing the words in English first, then in the small, rounded motions of Libras. Respect. Purpose. Patience. His hands trembled, but the signs steadied him, like planting seeds in straight rows. The elevator chimed at 32. The doors opened into a storm of polished shoes and raised voices. The boardroom's tension spilled into the hallway. Assistants moved quickly, their faces tight with worry. Through the wide-open doors, James glimpsed the scene. A long mahogany table surrounded by executives, papers stacked like fortresses. At the far end sat Dr. Rafael Moreira, his expression carved in stone, arms folded, eyes sharp. His hands moved. This is no way to treat a partner. The aides scribbled translations, sliding them across the table, but it was a poor substitute for a living bridge. Catherine Vale leaned forward, trying again with careful words, but her voice evaporated into the void. Pike, seated to her right, smirked, as if the silence itself proved his superiority. From the doorway, James felt the weight of the moment pressing against his ribs, and then he heard it. One of the executives muttering under his breath in frustration, "We just need someone. Anyone who knows sign." James's heart stopped. His notebook slipped in his sweaty palms. Anyone. It was as if the words had been aimed straight at him. His mind tumbled back through years compressed into heartbeats. the dusty shelves of Redridge's tiny library, where he found a dog-eared beginner's guide to ASL. Long evenings before the cracked mirror, moving his hands slowly, again and again, until the shapes became second nature. The season when Brazilian farm workers had shared the fields with his uncle, teaching him fragments of libras between rows of soybeans. They laughed when he tried, but their eyes had softened at his effort. Bridge builder, one had called him. Now, standing in the hallway of Cedar Line Tower, the fragments connected. The lines in his notebook no longer looked like childish scribbles. They were a tool sharper than Pike's pen, steadier than Catherine's carefully chosen phrases. James took a step forward, then another. His boots clicked on the polished floor, leaving faint traces of farm soil where none had ever dared to fall. "Hey!" one of the security staff whispered harshly. "Kid, you can't—" But before he could be pulled back, Catherine Vale's eyes caught him. For the briefest second, the CEO and the farm boy regarded each other across the crowded room. Something flickered in her gaze, curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of courage where it should not exist. James swallowed hard. His throat felt raw. Still, he forced the words out, his voice small but steady. I know some sign language." The room went still. Executives shifted uncomfortably. A few chuckled, thinking it a child's fantasy. Richard Pike did not laugh. He leaned back in his chair, eyebrows arched in cruel amusement. "This," he announced to the room, "is a billion-dollar negotiation, not a school play. Sit down, farm boy. Don't embarrass yourself further." Laughter rippled faintly. James's face burned, but his grip on the notebook tightened. He thought of his mother, scrubbing the floors above, unseen and unthanked. He thought of the word unseen, how it defined not only her, but him. And for the first time, he decided to push back against it. He raised his chin. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, the signs shaky but sincere. "Good morning. I am James. I want to help." For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the heater. Then something astonishing happened. Dr. Morera smiled. Not politely, not indulgently, but with genuine warmth, as if the boy's signs had cut through a wall none of the executives could breach. His reply in Libras was smooth, confident, and filled with restrained humor. "A boy from the lobby greets me before the company does. That says everything." James blinked, startled, then managed to translate aloud, voice soft but clear. "He says, a boy from the lobby greeted him before the company did, and that says everything." A stunned silence followed. Catherine's lips parted slightly, then curved into the faintest smile. She leaned back in her chair. "Then let the boy speak." Pike exploded. "This is absurd! Vale, are you seriously letting a child meddle in international law? This is a farce!" Catherine's tone cut him cleanly. "Richard, this boy is already doing more to build trust than your spreadsheets ever could. Sit down." For the first time, Pike had no reply. James took a shaky step forward, pulling his chair beside Morera's. He opened his notebook, scanning the 3 rules he had scribbled on the first page, rules that had guided his silent practice for months. Never guess. Always ask again. Translate meaning, not just words. Respect matters more than speed. He breathed deeply, then nodded to Morera, hands ready. The negotiation began again. At first, James stumbled. Some signs came out jagged, half forgotten, but each time, he caught himself, repeating them with careful humility. And each time, Morera's patience grew, not shrank. The investor's eyes softened, his hands slowing slightly, adjusting for the boy's pace. When technical terms arose, phrases like latencia tolerable, tolerable latency, James hesitated, then improvised. He shaped his fingers into a circle, pulsed it gently forward, then froze it mid-air. Delay that can still move. Moreira chuckled quietly, nodding in approval. He says, tolerable latency, James translated, voice firmer now. The executives leaned forward, astonished. What had seemed impossible minutes ago was happening. Word by word, sign by sign. Trust, fragile as spun glass, was being built by a boy whose boots still carried the soil of Redridge. By the end of the first hour, James's hands ached. Sweat dampened his hairline, but his eyes shone with something new, the knowledge that silence, when bridged, was stronger than any wall. Moreira leaned toward him during a pause, signing with deliberate care. You are brave, and bravery is the rarest language of all. James blinked hard, willing himself not to cry. He translated softly. He says, bravery is the rarest language. And for the first time since entering Cedar Line Tower, James felt not invisible, but seen. The mahogany table stretched like a river, and now, for the first time that morning, it began to flow. James Brooks sat close to Dr. Rafael Moreira, his thin shoulders hunched forward, notebook open before him. His pencil trembled slightly, ready to capture anything he could not yet sign. His patched sweater looked out of place beside silk ties and steel watches, but his eyes, those steady soil-colored eyes, were fixed on Moreira's hands with a devotion no machine could match. The negotiation resumed. Catherine Vale began with a simple phrase, careful, deliberate. We are here to explore not only profit, but partnership. James turned to Moreira. His hands moved slowly. We are here to explore, not just profit, but partnership. He paused, watching Moreira's face, then added the smallest gesture of emphasis, two hands pressing together, like soil held firm. Moreira's stern expression eased. His hands replied, purpose first, profit follows. James spoke the words aloud in English, voice soft but carrying through the room. He says, purpose first, profit follows. The executives shifted in their chairs. Something in the air had changed. For the first time, the table no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a bridge under construction. James remembered his notebook's 3 rules. 1. Never guess. Always ask again. When Moreira used a rapid gesture James did not know, he raised his hand politely, eyes lowered in humility. Please again? The investor repeated, slower this time, shaping the idea clearly. James caught it, nodded, then translated. There was no shame in asking twice. There was respect. 2. Translate meaning, not just words. When Catherine spoke of delivering value through logistics optimization, James hesitated. A literal rendering made no sense in sign. Instead, he shaped a truck with his hands, moving it across the air, then showed fewer crops falling away at the side. She means fewer losses on the road, delivering food safe. Moreira smiled faintly, understanding at once. 3. Respect matters more than speed. When Pike interrupted with jargon, synergistic revenue streams, James paused. He looked at Moreira, then shook his head gently. The man says complicated words about money. The meaning is more profit for him, less for you. Laughter rippled down the table. Pike's face darkened. James returned to his notebook, underlining his 3rd rule in pencil. Respect before speed. The first test came not from Pike, but from Moreira himself. The Brazilian investor lifted his hands in a swift series of gestures, testing the boy. The term was heavy, a phrase common in agritech but unknown to most outside, latencia tolerável, tolerable latency. James froze for half a second. The executives shifted, waiting for him to falter. Then he improvised. He drew a circle with both hands in the air, time flowing forward. He pushed it gently, then stopped, palm flat, showing delay. Then, with the smallest smile, he nudged the circle onward again. A delay that still moves. Moreira chuckled, nodding. His reply was a single, approving sign. Yes. James exhaled, then translated aloud. He says, tolerable latency. The executives blinked in astonishment. They had prepared graphs and equations to explain such terms. The boy had turned it into something even Pike could understand. From that moment, trust began to grow, fragile but unmistakable. The conversation deepened. Moreira spoke of food waste in global supply chains, millions of tons lost, farmers unpaid, families unfed. Catherine replied with her vision of a fairer distribution system, where AI and logistics could serve dignity, not just dollars. James became the current between them, carrying meaning back and forth, never losing sight of tone. When Moreira signed with firmness, James's voice carried strength. When Catherine softened her words, James's hands slowed, offering gentleness. Respect was moving across the table in two directions now, like water flowing through a newly built aqueduct. Still, shadows lingered. Richard Pike tapped his pen impatiently, cutting in whenever he could. His voice dripped with skepticism. This is all very poetic, but let's not romanticize logistics. We're not in the charity business. Dr. Moreira, you must understand, our investors demand exclusivity. James looked to Moreira, hands ready. The investor's reply came sharp, his fingers striking the air with force. Exclusivity is not partnership. Exclusivity is a fence. James hesitated. To translate literally would be simple, but his second rule echoed, translate meaning, not just words. He drew a quick breath and said aloud, steady and clear. He says, exclusivity is not partnership, it is a fence, a wall against trust. The words landed heavily. Catherine's eyes glimmered. Pike's jaw clenched. James lowered his gaze to his notebook, hiding the faint tremor in his hands. For the first time in Cedar Line Tower's history, the meeting did not orbit numbers. It orbited something rarer. When Moreira spoke of the dignity of truck drivers, James carried his tone with reverence. When Catherine spoke of slowing down to preserve trust, James shaped the signs carefully, palms pressing together like a prayer. Even when Pike scoffed, James did not falter. He carried meaning across the bridge, unbroken. Hours passed, yet James forgot his fatigue. The ache in his fingers felt like planting, row by row, furrow by furrow, meaning sown carefully into the soil of trust. And just as a bridge stands because each stone supports the next, so too did this negotiation begin to stand. Because one boy, unseen and underestimated, dared to carry words like stones across a river of silence. By late afternoon, the first outlines of an agreement shimmered faintly on the horizon. Nothing was signed, nothing secured, but the foundation had been laid. When the recess was called, Catherine stood and addressed the room. We will reconvene after a short break, but let it be clear, today, something important has begun. Moreira nodded, signing with calm certainty. Today, a bridge was built. James whispered the translation, barely above a breath. He says, today, a bridge was built. and though his voice was quiet, it filled the room. For the first time in his 12 years, James Brooks felt the invisible weight shift. He was no longer the boy Pike had sneered at in the lobby. He was the bridge the Empire had needed all along. The snow thickened against the glass as the afternoon settled in. On the 32nd floor, the lights warmed to a softer hue, and the negotiation, which had begun as a brittle exchange of positions, now moved with the steadier rhythm of shared purpose. James sat between Catherine Vale and Dr. Rafael Moreira, a slim boy in a patched sweater, the living conduit between two worlds. He had rewritten his 3 rules in the margin of his notebook, in larger letters this time. Never guess. Ask again. Translate meaning, not just words. Respect before speed. Underneath, he had added a 4th in pencil, almost a prayer. 4. Listen for what the heart is saying. Catherine lifted her pen and spoke carefully. Let's start with waste reduction. Our models show average loss rates of 17 to 22% across long-haul routes in winter. Causes: temperature excursions, traffic delays, poor last-mile coordination. We can bring that below 10% within 6 months. James shaped the signs with both precision and warmth. She says winter losses are 17 to 22%. Causes: cold chain breaks, late trucks, bad last mile. She says 10% in 6 months. Moreira's hands responded with measured skepticism. 10% is not a number. It is a promise with an engine. What engine? James's voice fitted itself to the investor's tone. He says, 10% is only a number unless there is a working engine behind it. What engine will drive the promise? Catherine nodded. Route clustering with dynamic thresholds. If the system detects a rising risk, say ambient temperature trending below safe tolerance, it triggers a slow safe protocol, auto reassignment of loads to the nearest insulated hub, even if it adds an hour. We model it with a queue discipline that prioritizes integrity over speed. James translated, then slowed his hands to explain the metaphor. If the air gets too cold, the system moves food to a warm place first, even if delivery is later. The rule is, food alive before fast. Moreira's mouth tugged at one corner, a nearly smile. He replied, integrity before speed. Yes. Farmers pay the price when speed is worshipped. Drivers, too. James repeated it aloud. The room fell quiet on the phrase integrity before speed. Even the heating vents seemed to breathe more softly. Pike's pen tapped the table, a mosquito in a chapel. Delays mean costs, he said. We're not compensated for noble intentions. James waited, but Moreira did not look at Pike. He addressed Catherine through the boy. In the first phase, I want a contractual floor price for farmer cooperatives when the system triggers slow-safe. If our engines slow, they do not lose. Catherine folded her hands. We can set a floor, and we can publish a weekly respect ledger, a transparent report, why we slowed, whom it protected, and who benefited. James signed the phrase respect ledger slowly, liking the weight of it. A book of respect. Reasons for slowing. Who it protected. Everyone sees. Moreira nodded. Good. Respect that hides is not respect. Pike cleared his throat. Our public filings don't need sentiment. He turned toward the boy as if to remind the room where the weakest plank was. Translate this correctly. Public transparency invites litigation. James looked to Moreira, palms open, inviting the choice of tone. The investor signed coolly. Litigation chases secrets. Transparency invites trust. James gave the words back to the room, gentle but firm. He says, lawsuits chase secrets. When we show our reasons, trust comes in the front door. Pike sank a fraction in his chair. Catherine resumed. Next, driver dignity. If we slow for integrity, drivers must not absorb the punishment. We propose a fairness index, on-time bonus and a safe delay bonus. We refuse the culture of invisible costs. James paused to think, then rendered it as a balanced scale with both hands. Drivers get paid for being on time and also for protecting the food. We refuse to hide the cost on their backs. The investor's hands rose again, lively now. Add rest windows that the algorithm honors like sacred ground. If a driver reaches fatigue threshold, the schedule bends around the human. James translated, then added with a hesitant glance at Catherine. He says, the rest windows must be treated like sacred ground. Catherine took a breath. Done. Pike spread his hands. We are not clergy. We are a logistics firm. James did not translate the jab. He waited. Moreira made a small, almost weary sign. The body is the first machine. Maintain it or the others fail. Catherine met the boy's eyes. Please carry that exactly. James did. The words settled like a log on a winter fire. They moved to farmer protections, moisture content, temperature bands, maximum jolts per pallet. Catherine described an open telemetry standard so cooperatives could read their cargo's vital signs in real time. No black boxes, she said. Shared dashboards, shared data, shared blame if something fails. James signed with care, forming a small rectangle in the air, then opening it like a window. No secrets in the data. Farmers see the same numbers as the company. If something breaks, we all know, and we fix it together. Moreira's reply came with a new energy. Add grievance triggers. If any group, farmers, drivers, or communities, signals a dignity breach, the system slows until we resolve it. Dual veto? Catherine asked, testing the words. 2 keys. Either side can stop the machine. James's hands made a simple shape. 2 keys turning, the engine pausing. Even before the legal language hardened, the image felt inevitable. Pike's voice sharpened. We're sliding toward a governance nightmare. Dignity triggers, respect ledgers. These are brakes, not engines. Catherine turned to him. Brakes save lives when engines fail, and we've been failing. James watched the exchange the way he watched storms on the farm, reading direction, feeling pressure change. He sensed the room's rhythm, how Catherine's words now timed to Moreira's, how Pike's interjections came off the beat, like a drum struck late. They broke for tea. Steam rose. Snow pressed its quiet face against the glass. James cradled his paper cup in both hands to warm his fingers. When he set it down, he wrote in neat block letters on a fresh page, "If respect is the currency, pay first." He did not know yet that the sentence would be spoken aloud. They reconvened, and Catherine leaned forward, voice low and steady. "There's one more pillar," she said. "Community. Distribution depots can be heavy footprints. We'll adopt a leave nothing worse covenant. No expansion unless it improves local roads, lighting, and air metrics. We absorb the externalities we create." James worked slowly, choosing his signs as one chooses seed. We promise not to grow without healing the ground we stand on. Roads, lights, clean air. We pay for the harm we risk. Moreira's eyes lit. Now we are speaking agriculture, not conquest. Pike laughed once, dry and small. Poetry doesn't lower cost of capital. The investor turned to him directly for the first time. His signs were quiet, almost conversational. Cost of capital falls when risk falls. Respect reduces risk. Poetry, if true, is math. James breathed, feeling the shape of the sentence land in his chest before it left his lips. He says, when respect is real, risk falls. True poetry is mathematics. A hush followed. Catherine's pen hovered, then moved, one clear stroke across a page as if she were underlining the soul of the meeting. They turned to specifics. Temperature controls, plus to 1.5 degrees as for dairy, plus to 0.5 degrees during handoff. Vibration thresholds, no more than 0.7 G sustained over 5 minutes. Alarms at 1.2 G. Driver rest, a hard stop at 6 hours continuous, flexible resumption after restorative break. Farmer floor price indexed to the 30-day regional median plus dignity premium during slow safe events. A shared dashboard protocol, open, auditable, multilingual. Grievance triggers defined, logged, and resolved within fixed windows. The dry words of policy, assembled like beams. The boy moved them into place. And then the moment came. It was small at first. Catherine finished describing how the weekly reports would be posted, public, legible, and short enough for a grandmother to read at the kitchen table. The executives nodded. It was sound. It was brave. But it did not yet have a center. Moreira sat back. He watched James, not the slides, not the clauses, but the boy. His hands rose, unhurried, voice made visible. Let me say it plain. Respect is the currency. With it, we can afford risk. Without it, even billions bankrupt us. James did not speak for a heartbeat. He saw his own penciled line on the page. He looked up, met Catherine's eyes, then the others. He lifted his chin and gave the sentence to the room, word for word, in a voice that did not waver. Respect is the currency. With it, we can afford risk. Without it, even billions bankrupt us. Silence. Not the awkward kind that comes from confusion, but the reverent kind that knows a truth has just been set on the table, and it is everyone's job not to knock it over. The snow pressed closer, as if listening. Far below, the lobby continued its clockwork, unaware that on the 32nd floor, a new unit of value had been minted. Catherine's reply was barely louder than a breath. Then we will pay in advance, she said. In this company, respect is not a rebate. It is the first deposit. James translated. Moreira's nod was slow and full. Pike's gaze flickered, searching for a purchase on the moment. He found a number. Fine. Respect is policy, but where do we put it on the balance sheet? Catherine did not look at him. She looked at the boy. In the risk column, she said, and on the first line. James carried it across. The words felt heavier in his mouth than any metric he had ever learned. They moved to finalize the afternoon's draft. We can end today with a memorandum of understanding, Catherine said. No signatures yet, but direction shared. Moreira agreed. Add one sentence at the top. He signed it slowly so the boy could write it exactly. This partnership begins with the recognition that respect is the first word of every language. James wrote, then read it back to him in English, then signed it again. Hands steady now. The investor's eyes shone, and he lifted a hand in thanks. The rhythm of the room had changed entirely. Pike still interjected from time to time, but each comment landed off tempo, like a metronome someone had bumped. His authority, once a loud drum, sounded suddenly hollow in the timbered hush that follows a hymn. When at last they stood, the table held a shape it had not held at noon. Not a fortress, not a battlefield, but a bridge with guardrails and honest weight. As people gathered their papers, Catherine stepped closer to James. We're not finished, she said. But something began today because you chose not to remain invisible. James looked down at his boots, then up again. Ma'am, I only moved hands. You moved a company, she answered. He turned to Morera, who signed with a gentleness that startled him. "When I was 12, no room listened to me. Thank you for making this one listen." James translated for the last time that day, voice soft. He says, "Thank you." The snow had deepened to a white hush when they left the room. In the corridor, where the earlier storm of panic had run itself ragged, there was only the sound of quiet footsteps and the faint hum of heat. James tucked his notebook against his chest. The pencil line he had added, "If respect is the currency, pay first," ran straight and sure. Downstairs, the lobby lights glowed like coals in a hearth. Somewhere above, a printer began to whisper the first memorandum pages into being. He thought of his mother, still working, and of Red Ridge County, where you could hear the snow fall if you stopped to listen. He thought of drivers who would get a bonus for choosing safety, of farmers who would see their data and be believed, of a ledger where respect would be counted aloud. Empire or farm, boardroom or barn, the math did not change. Where respect increased, risk went down. He did not know how to chart it yet, but he had felt it, like a new warmth in a cold room. The boy inhaled, exhaled, and stood a little taller. Tomorrow would be harder. There would be clauses to argue, storms of pride to weather, the old habits of power to unlearn. But tonight the currency had been named, and the first deposit made. And for a child taught all his life to move quietly, there was a quiet kind of victory in that. By morning, the 32nd floor had transformed again. The long mahogany table was reset with new carafes of water, new stacks of contracts, and, most telling of all, new drafts of clauses marked in bold red. James sat once more beside Dr. Rafael Morera, his notebook open, his hands ready. The boy looked tired. Dark smudges lingered under his eyes from the long night before. But his focus was sharp. His pencil hovered like a plow above the soil of the page, prepared to carve each furrow of meaning as it came. Catherine Vale entered, her coat still damp from snow. She greeted Morera with a nod, then turned to her executives. "Today," she said firmly, "we commit clauses, draft to draft until the bridge we began yesterday can hold the weight." James signed, careful and steady. "Today we build the bridge stronger, clause by clause, until it can hold weight." Morera responded with a brisk, approving gesture. "Good. Let us see which stones belong and which break under pressure." The meeting began. At first, the progress was smooth. They affirmed the respect ledger, a transparent record of every dignity decision. They finalized the dual veto, 2 keys to stop any system violating human worth. For each clause, James carried the words across faithfully, pausing only to ask for clarity when jargon thickened. But then the air shifted. Richard Pike cleared his throat, his pen tapping the table with a metronomic insistence. "There's one matter we haven't codified properly," he said. "Intellectual property." James signed the phrase, "intellectual property," with a hesitant twist of his fingers, remembering the book in the library that had called ideas the harvest of the mind. Pike leaned forward. "We cannot expose our investors to open-ended sharing. Exclusivity on all current and future technologies developed under this partnership is non-negotiable." James stopped. His rule whispered in him. Translate meaning, not just words. He looked to Morera, unsure how to soften the sharp edges. At last, he signed, "The man says, exclusivity on all now, and all future ideas. He says, this cannot be changed." Morera froze. His hands came alive with fury. That is not partnership. That is ransoming the future, a fence around seeds that do not yet exist. James translated, his voice trembling but honest. "He says, that is not partnership. That is ransoming the future. It is a fence around seeds not yet planted. The air went brittle. Catherine lowered her pen. Pike smirked faintly. Tell him exclusivity protects him too. It ensures no competitor can undercut him using shared discoveries. Morera's reply was sharp. Protection is not prison. He offers a prison. James felt his cheeks flush. He turned to the table and spoke the words slowly. He says, protection is not prison. What you offer is a prison. The silence after was long and heavy. Pike leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. Let's pause and remember, we are relying on a 12-year-old child for translation. Do we really believe he comprehends the nuance of international intellectual property law? He is farming with his hands in air. This is billions of dollars. James's stomach twisted. His fingers twitched uselessly against the notebook. Catherine's gaze hardened. He has carried nuance more faithfully than you, Richard. He built a bridge in a single day that you have been tearing down with every word. Pike's jaw tightened. He doesn't even know the law. James found himself whispering, almost to the page, but I know respect. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Yet they carried across the room like a pebble dropped into a still pond. Morera caught them, his eyes bright. He lifted his hands. Deliberate. The boy is right. Law without respect is only weapon. Respect makes law possible. James repeated it aloud, his voice steadier now. He says, law without respect is only a weapon. Respect makes law possible. Catherine closed her folder. Richard, the clause you propose dies here. We are not fencing futures, we are planting them. The clash escalated. Pike raised his voice. Do you not see? Without exclusivity, we bear all the cost while competitors steal the fruit. You are gambling with shareholder trust. Catherine's answer was firm. Shareholder trust is already broken when we strip dignity to pad margins. You confuse control with security. Morera's hands moved like a verdict. Security is trust. Trust is respect. Respect cannot be patented. James, translating, felt the words vibrate in his bones. He wanted to etch them into his notebook forever. Respect cannot be patented. The storm peaked. Pike slammed his pen against the table. This is lunacy. We are letting a farm boy guide billion-dollar stakes. Do you not see the farce? He is nothing but a child who wandered in from the lobby. James's ears burned. His throat ached. He wanted to shrink into his patched sweater, to disappear. But then, unexpectedly, Catherine turned toward him. Her voice softened, but carried enough to cut through Pike's rage. James, she said, you may not know international law, but yesterday you taught us the 3 rules that saved this room. Will you repeat them? James blinked. His hands rose, trembling, then steadied. 1. Never guess. Ask again. 2. Translate meaning, not just words. 3. Respect before speed. He lowered his hands, his voice a whisper. And listen for what the heart is saying. The executives watched, silent. Pike sputtered but found no words. Morera signed toward Catherine, his movements solemn. The boy has given this table more law than any attorney here. The law of bridges, the law of respect. James spoke it aloud, and when the last word faded, the storm had broken. The meeting did not end with signatures. The intellectual property clause was struck down, red lines across Pike's draft. Instead, they agreed to joint stewardship. Discoveries made together would belong to both, guarded not by exclusivity, but by dual veto. 2 keys, 2 hands. James signed the clause carefully, like setting the keystone of a bridge. When it was done, Catherine leaned back. Her eyes swept the table, then rested on Pike. "Richard, today you chose walls. James chose a bridge. Decide which kind of builder you wish to be." Pike did not answer. His pen lay silent on the table. As the room emptied, James lingered, packing his notebook slowly. His hands ached, but his chest felt lighter. He had not broken. He had stood, even when Pike's words had cut like barbed wire. Dr. Moreira leaned toward him, signing quietly. "Sometimes respect is the only argument left, and it is always the strongest." James translated softly, almost to himself. Respect is the only argument left, and the strongest. The boy from Red Ridge had not only stood up to Pike, he had stood tall in his own eyes. The snow came heavy that night. Thick flakes pressed against the tall windows of Cedar Line Tower, soft at first, then harder, until the city itself seemed to vanish behind a wall of white. Cars below crawled, headlights dimmed by the blizzard. On the 32nd floor, the meeting had stretched from morning into evening, then into night. The mahogany table, once polished and proud, now looked like a battlefield. Pages scattered, pens uncapped, half-drunk cups of tea leaving rings on expensive wood. James Brooks sat slumped beside Dr. Moreira, his patched sweater drawn tight, notebook open but smudged from hours of penciled notes. His fingers ached. Every muscle in his small arms trembled from the strain of signing without pause. He was 12, but tonight he felt ancient. Still, he did not stop. Catherine Vale leaned over a fresh draft, reading aloud slowly. Clause 17. Any deployment of predictive algorithms shall be subject to dual veto. Either party may halt the system if evidence of human dignity violation is found. Halt is immediate and binding. James moved his hands, deliberate even as they shook. She says, if the machine harms dignity, either side can stop it, immediately. Moreira's eyes sharpened. He signed, add. Even suspicion is enough to pause. Better a false stop than a true harm. James translated, his voice low but firm. Catherine nodded, scribbling the words, better false stop than true harm. It was late. The building was nearly empty now, janitors moving quietly in distant corridors. Outside, the storm howled, but inside the room was all hushed urgency. The boy's exhaustion showed. His signs faltered. Once, midway through a sentence, his hands dropped entirely. He pressed them against the table, trying to still the tremor. His vision blurred. The snow outside and the lamplight inside bled into one. Moreira touched his shoulder gently. His hands signed, rest, just rest. James shook his head stubbornly. No, sir. Not yet. Catherine's voice softened. James, you've done enough for 3 men. You can stop. But the boy only clutched his notebook tighter. If I stop, the bridge breaks. The words were not prideful. They were simple truth. Clause after clause, they advanced. Clause 21, Community Covenant. No new depot built without proof of improved local infrastructure. Roads, lights, air quality. Clause 25, Driver Dignity. Rest windows treated as sacred ground. Algorithms bend around fatigue. Clause 31, Respect Ledger. Weekly, public, short enough for any grandmother to read at the kitchen table. James carried each clause across with hands that shook like branches in the wind. Sometimes he stumbled, but he never guessed. He asked again, always asking, always clarifying. And slowly, something like a covenant formed on the table, heavier than money, warmer than law. By midnight, Catherine set down her pen. She rubbed her temples, then spoke with the solemnity of ceremony. "This," she said, "is the beginning of our partnership. It is only draft, but it carries our intent." She reached for a fresh page, and in neat strokes she wrote the first line. "This partnership begins with the recognition that respect is the first word of every language." The words glowed on the page like a lantern in snow. Catherine slid the page across the table. "James," she said, "would you read it back to us?" His voice quivered with fatigue, but he read every syllable steady. "This partnership begins with the recognition that respect is the first word of every language." Silence followed, thick and tender. Morera's eyes filled, and for the first time that long day, tears slid quietly down his cheeks. He signed slowly, reverently, "Yes, that is the seed. That is enough." James spoke the words, and his own eyes blurred. He blinked hard, unwilling to weep in front of these giants, but his throat burned. The storm raged. The building groaned against the wind. Yet in that room, something sacred held. Pike sat stiff, his face unreadable. He had fought, argued, belittled. But now he was silent, perhaps sensing the tide had turned. The words on the page were heavier than any of his objections. Catherine closed her folder. "We adjourn until morning," she said softly. "But tonight, remember this. Respect was written first, and it will be written last." James closed his notebook at last. His fingers could barely hold the pencil. He leaned back, staring at the snow against the window. The city was invisible, swallowed whole, but the boy felt the room alight with a different visibility, the kind that comes when unseen voices are finally heard. Later, as the executives filed out, Catherine lingered. She placed a hand lightly on James's shoulder. "You built this bridge," she said. "Do you understand that?" James shook his head. "I only translated." "No." Her voice deepened. "You interpreted hearts. That is rarer and harder." He said nothing, but the warmth of her words sank into him like fire on a cold farm night. Morera, standing by the window, signed one last phrase toward him. "When I was 12, I thought no one would ever hear me. Tonight, I heard you." James translated, barely able to speak. "He says, when he was 12, no one heard him. Tonight, he heard me." The snow thickened, pressing white silence against the glass. James rode the elevator down alone. The building hummed softly, each floor descending like a breath let out. When he stepped into the lobby, the janitors had set their carts aside and were watching the snow drift under the street lamps. His mother, Janelle, was among them, her mop leaning against the wall. She looked up as James approached. "You're late," she said, half worried, half teasing. "And you look tired enough to drop." James managed a faint smile. He clutched his notebook close. "I helped today, Mama." Her brow furrowed at the tremor in his voice. "With what?" He hesitated, then whispered, "With respect." Janelle stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to read in his tired eyes what those words meant. Then, wordlessly, she wrapped him in her arms. Through the glass doors behind them, the storm kept falling, whitening the world. But in the warmth of his mother's embrace, James felt for the first time that the empire above had written his invisible life into its first line. Morning broke, washed and pale after the blizzard, the city wearing its hush like a shawl. Plows had carved narrow channels in the streets. The sun hovered low and bright, as if the sky itself were catching its breath. Inside Cedar Line Tower, cables and cameras were strung across the atrium like winter vines. A glass podium stood on a low platform, flanked by 2 flags and a row of folding chairs in dignified black. On a side table, bottles of water, mugs of coffee going gently cold. On the far wall, a screen that would display the first line of the draft as a backdrop. Respect is the first word of every language. James arrived with his notebook tucked under his arm, boots scrubbed as clean as he could manage, sweater mended again by his mother's midnight needle. He paused in the arch of the lobby, feeling the day's weight settle over his small shoulders. The room pulsed with adult urgency, producers checking microphones, reporters rehearsing questions, assistants moving with the choreography of the important and late. "James?" Elena called softly from the registration table, eyes warm. "You're early." He nodded. "I like to see the room breathe before it fills." It was something his uncle said about barns before harvest. Walk through empty first, so you can feel what belongs there when it's full. Elena leaned closer. The professional interpreter made it through. She's upstairs with the CEO. A beat. "You did something rare yesterday." James lowered his eyes. "We all did." He found a quiet corner near a potted ficus and opened his notebook. On the first page, his rules waited like old friends. Never guess. Ask again. Translate meaning, not just words. Respect before speed. Listen for what the heart is saying. He traced each line with a finger, then added in smaller letters, "Let the voice match the soul." Reporters began to gather. Camera red lights blinked awake. The professional interpreter, a woman in her 30s with steady hands and the crisp poise born from many stages, descended with the executive party and took her place to the right of the podium, at easy sightline to Dr. Rafael Morera. She nodded to James, kind but distant, as a violinist might nod to a boy who loved music. Catherine Vale stepped to the podium first. Her face held a calm that comes from choosing a center and refusing to be drawn off it. She thanked the press for braving the storm, thanked the teams who had worked through the night, thanked the building staff by name. Then she spoke of the draft, how it was not a victory, but a beginning. "Today," she said, "we will not announce a number. We will announce a direction." James watched her mouth shape the words, then glanced at Morera, whose eyes were on the interpreter, attentive. The interpreter's hands delivered Catherine's English into Libras with efficiency, clean, precise, technically flawless. And yet, some thread was missing, the slight softness Catherine had deliberately put in her voice, the cadence of care before speed. James felt the gap like a cold seam in a warm coat. Morera listened without complaint. He had lived long enough to recognize the difference between accuracy and presence. He had learned to be grateful for accuracy, even when presence did not come along. Catherine finished and gestured to him. "Dr. Morera," she said, "will speak to why the words respect ledger and dual veto are not legal tricks, but moral guardrails." The interpreter nodded to James as if to say, "Watch how it's done." James nodded back, shy and sincere. "Teach me." Morera stepped forward, hands by his sides, posture unadorned. When he began to sign, he did so with the gravity of someone telling an old story under a tree. "I grew up hearing silence call my name," his hands said. "And I learned that silence is not emptiness. Silence is a kind of listening." The interpreter moved, clear, crisp. "I grew up with silence. Silence is listening." It was correct. But in shaving the sentence to fit the clock, the breath inside it vanished. The room heard a statement, not a confession. James watched the air change. He could almost hear his uncle's warning from years ago. Never thresh the grain so hard you break the bread's future. Morera went on. We talk about waste and engines, routes and thresholds. But the mathematics of dignity is simple. If the person at the edge is safer, everyone in the circle is safer. Respect reduces risk. This is not poetry. This is risk modeling. The interpreter voiced it perfectly, tone neutral, vowels balanced. A few reporters nodded. One scribbled risk model equals respect. But the murmurs in the back, old voices of markets and momentum, stayed cool. Something essential was not landing. Catherine noticed. Her eyes flicked to James and then back to the row where Pike sat, arms crossed, expression carefully blank. The interpreter continued, professional as a metronome. Morera's hands slowed. He looked across the room and his gaze found the boy by the ficus. There is a difference, he signed, almost imperceptibly altering his rhythm, between words that reach the ear and meanings that reach the heart. The interpreter spoke the line as written. James felt his chest tighten. He thought of last night's sentence. Respect is the first word of every language. He thought of how Morera's eyes had filled, and how the interpreter's voice just now had placed the sentence on the table like a paperweight instead of a lantern. He closed his notebook, and he walked forward. Security shifted, but Catherine's small gesture stilled them. James stopped at the foot of the platform and looked to the interpreter, then to Morera. He lifted his hands, slowly, asking permission. Morera's smile came like thaw. He nodded once. The interpreter stepped back half a pace, a professional's courtesy when a client invites a second voice. James breathed in, out. He remembered his fourth rule. Listen for what the heart is saying. He looked to the cameras, then back to the investor. Dr. Morera says, James began, voice soft but carrying, that silence is not a void. It is a way of listening that the world forgets. And that if the person on the edge, the farmer far from the city, the driver alone at 2 a.m., is made safer, then everyone inside the circle sleeps better. That's not poetry, he added gently. It's how risk truly falls. It was the same meaning, but now the words moved with the cadence of the hands that made them. The room warmed by a degree you could not record on the thermostat. Morera signed again, deeper now, trusting the boy to carry not only facts, but breath. You want to know why we wrote a respect ledger? It's not for applause. It's so my mother, who never finished school, can read why a truck was late and know it was because someone chose dignity over speed. You want to know why dual veto matters? Because when a system is strong, it must be stoppable by the smallest voice in the room. If the smallest cannot stop it, it is not strength, it is momentum pretending to be wisdom. The interpreter could have voiced it cleanly. James voiced it with a softness that did not blur the edges. It's not for headlines, he said, eyes flicking to the back row where an editor's pen hovered. It's so a mother at a kitchen table can read a simple page and know respect was paid first. And dual veto, he continued, is not a trick to slow progress. It's a promise that the smallest person in the circle can pull the brake when the machine forgets what it's for. A few reporters looked up from their notes. A cameraman lowered his eye from the viewfinder, just enough to listen without glass in front of him. On the screen behind the podium, the sentence glowed brighter, as if the morning finally found the window. Respect is the first word of every language. Pike stood. He did not shout. That would read poorly on camera. He pitched his voice for maximum sting. Is this our strategy now? He asked. Relying on a child to explain complex governance. Is that professionalism? The room's attention pivoted. Catherine didn't move. Morera did. He signed a single line. Each word balanced as if set on a scale. Professionalism is respect. And yesterday, a farm boy did it better than you. James did not add polish. He gave the sentence the exact weight it carried from the hands that made it. Professionalism is respect, he said. And yesterday a farm boy did it better than you. It didn't land like a slap. It landed like a bell. Clear. Undeniable. Reporters blinked, then scribbled. A producer mouthed that line. Pike's mouth opened, closed. He sat. Questions unfurled. A journalist from a national paper. How will you price the respect ledger decisions? Catherine. We price them as reductions in tail risk and as increases in retention. We'll publish the math. James carried the tone, calm, accountable. Another from a trade journal. Dual veto. Won't that cripple deployment? Morera. A machine that cannot stop is a danger. Speed with conscience is faster than speed with crash. James. Stopping is not failure, it is control. The professional interpreter stepped in smoothly for technical stretches, partnering rather than competing. She voiced parameters and thresholds with the precise numbers they demanded. Plus 0.5 degrees C during handoffs, vibration alarms at 1.2 G, grievance trigger resolution windows. James listened gratefully. Bridge work is better with more than one builder, and then re-entered when meaning threatened to thin. A local reporter, older, thoughtful, asked the question that excused no one. What will you do when following the ledger costs you a contract? Catherine didn't look to her team. She looked to the people who had taught her the answer in the last 48 hours. Pay it, she said. If respect is the currency, we pay first. James moved his hands without thinking. Pay first, and then said it aloud for those in the back. The line felt like a signature. When the conference closed, applause rose, tentative at first, then steadier. Not the roaring approval of a spectacle, but the careful clapping of people who understood the stakes and wished to be on the right side of them. The interpreter approached James. Up close, the professionalism softened into personhood. You carry tone well, she said. That's the last 10% most of us chase our entire careers. James flushed. I chase it because my mother taught me to listen with my eyes. That, she said, is also professionalism. Morera came to the edge of the platform, and the two interpreters formed a small triangle of shared craft. He signed to both. There is room on a bridge for many feet. Thank you. Catherine joined them. You'll both be needed, she said. To James, especially you, when the room forgets its center. He looked down at his boots, at the clean lines where scrubbed leather met old scuff. Rooms forget quickly, he said. It was not cynical. It was observant. Then we remind them, Catherine replied. From the press rows, Pike's gaze pricked cold as sleet. He was calculating something, but it was math without respect, and the numbers had begun to betray him. Later, as cameras packed and voices thinned to the clatter of cases and latches, a woman in a quilted coat hesitated near the platform. She was not press. She wore a badge that read facilities. Her hands were rough with work. Are you the boy? She asked, not unkindly. James nodded. She glanced at the sentence on the wall, then back at him. I don't know that language, she said, but I understood what he meant. Thank you. James didn't know what to say. He signed thank you and said it too. She smiled, small and real, and returned to her cart. The atrium emptied. The morning had warmed enough to start drip melts from the eaves. The lobby smelled of coffee and wet wool and the faint citrus of cleaner. James stood a moment longer, letting the room breathe after it had been full, as he liked to do. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line beneath his rules. Let the smallest voice stop the largest machine. Then he closed the book and went to find his mother, who would be finishing her shift, who would want to know if the world had heard him, and more importantly, if he had used his hands with care. Outside, the city thawed by inches. Inside, an empire rehearsed a different grammar. Not markets first, not storms first, but the respect that makes both survivable. And for a boy who had learned to listen with his eyes, that sounded like the beginning of a language he could speak for a very long time. The storm outside had passed, but in the 32nd floor conference room, a colder front lingered. Papers were stacked in neat piles, signatures yet to be written, clauses yet to be tested in the wild. The respect ledger draft glowed on the wall screen, but around the edges of the table, unease stirred like a draft under a door. Richard Pike had not spoken since the press conference. His silence was not humility. It was calculation. He sat with arms crossed, eyes fixed on the boy. As if the farm soil still clinging invisibly to James Brooks's boots were a threat greater than any market rival. Catherine Vale noticed. She had spent her career reading balance sheets, but she had learned to read faces better. And Pike's face now held the brittleness of someone whose authority had cracked, but who had not yet admitted the break. That evening, Catherine called for a closed session. No reporters, no guests, only the senior leadership of Cedarline, with James present by invitation and Dr. Morera seated calmly, his aides at his side. The room was dimmer than before, lit more like a chapel than a boardroom. The snow had melted into dripping icicles outside the window, ticking faintly against the glass. Catherine began. Before we finalize anything further, we must confront a problem of alignment. Contracts are not only paper, they are culture. And culture is already splitting in this room. Her eyes rested on Pike. The man straightened, ready. If you're referring to my insistence on exclusivity clauses, I was safeguarding shareholder value. That is my duty. Not indulging in... He waved a hand vaguely toward James. Sentimental theatrics. James lowered his eyes. The words stung, though he had been stung before. Catherine's voice was measured, but iron ran beneath it. This is not about duty. It is about contempt. For partners, for drivers, for farmers, for colleagues, for this boy who has done what none of us could. Pike snorted. We cannot let the future of a multi-billion-dollar firm be dictated by a janitor's son. Are we children, needing parables about bridges and ledgers to feel good while competitors eat us alive? The words dropped like stones. For a moment, no one moved. Then James lifted his chin. His hands rose, slow but steady. I am not here to dictate. I am here to listen. Listening built this bridge. He translated aloud for the table. I'm not dictating. I only listened. Listening built this bridge. Morera leaned forward, his signs sharp and unambiguous. The boy listened, and trust grew. You spoke, and trust died. Which is worth more? James's voice carried the words across. The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine stood. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Richard Pike, she said, for 2 days you have reduced partnership to profit, respect to weakness, and vision to fear. You belittled the one person in this room who built us a future. I will not let you poison what we are building. Pike's face reddened. You can't dismiss me. The board entrusted me with leadership, Catherine cut in. And leadership is not measured in margins. It is measured in bridges. Her hand pressed a button on the console. A staff liaison entered quietly, holding an envelope. Catherine took it and set it before Pike. Effective immediately, your tenure as Vice President of Operations is ended. Security will assist you in collecting your things. You are relieved of duty. Gasps flickered around the table. Pike shot to his feet. This is madness! Catherine's gaze didn't waver. Madness is mistaking fear for strategy. Leave! For the first time, Pike looked smaller. Not defeated, just emptied of the force that had once made him loud. He gathered his papers with shaking hands, glaring once more at James, then at Morera, then finally at Catherine. But no words came. He left the room, footsteps echoing harshly until the door closed. The air shifted. It was not triumphant. It was solemn, like the silence after a storm has broken the trees but spared the house. James sat very still, notebook unopened on his lap. He had not wished for Pike's downfall, but he had learned something in watching it. Authority without listening is weight without balance. It topples itself. Catherine turned to him, voice softer now. "Do you see, James? Power is not what a man keeps. It is what he gives, so others may cross." He nodded slowly. "So, respect is power?" Morera smiled faintly, his hands moving with deliberate grace. "Respect is the only power that lasts. Everything else is noise." James translated, his voice steady. "Respect is the only power that lasts. Everything else is noise." The session continued, quieter now. Without Pike's interruptions, the table seemed to breathe differently. They revisited the clauses, strengthening some, refining others. The respect ledger gained teeth, metrics for transparency, timelines for publication. The dual veto clause grew into a living safeguard, embedded not just in governance, but in the system's very code. James carried each idea across, his hands steadier now, his voice calmer. He felt the bridge under his feet had survived its first test, and that it could hold. When the work paused, Catherine leaned back, weary but resolute. "We are no longer gatekeepers. We are bridge builders. And today, the cost of forgetting that was made clear." Her eyes met James's. "Don't forget this lesson. Titles do not protect people from falling. Listening does." Later, as the meeting adjourned, James lingered by the window. The snow had stopped, and the city glistened wet under the lamplight, icicles dripping steady as metronomes. His mother's voice came back to him from Redridge. "Stay quiet, James. Don't cause trouble." He had stayed quiet for so long. And yet, when he had spoken, when he had signed, trouble had come anyway. But it was a different kind of trouble, the kind that clears old rot and makes room for new planting. Morera joined him, hands moving gently. "Do not fear that you caused his fall. He built his own wall too high. You only showed it was brittle." James nodded. "I think sometimes silence can save, and sometimes it can bury." The investor smiled, eyes kind. "You are learning what most men twice your age never learn. That is why you will build more bridges than we can imagine." As James left the tower that night with his mother, the city seemed less hostile. The glass and steel were still cold, but he knew now that they were not unbreakable. Empires could change shape when someone dared to speak from the silence. In his notebook, he wrote one line before bed. "Power is listening, and listening is respect." He underlined it twice, then closed the book, the storm of Pike's departure echoing not as tragedy, but as lesson. A year had passed since the storm in Cedar Line Tower. Redridge County had changed little in that time. The fields still stretched brown and quiet in winter, the roads still cracked where frost bit them each year, and the barns still leaned tired against the horizon. But for James Brooks, 12 years old, everything felt different. Because now, people wrote to him. Envelopes arrived with stamps from cities he had never seen, letters from children who wrote, "I was invisible too until I heard about you." From teachers who said, "My students read your story aloud in class, and they sign the words respect together." from a farmer in Brazil who scrawled in careful Portuguese, "Você é um ponteiro de almas. You are a builder of bridges of souls." Each letter James folded carefully into his notebook until the book grew thick with pages not his own. At Cedarline, Catherine Vale had kept her promise. Pike was gone, his name fading into the footnotes of corporate memory. In his place, Janelle Brooks, James's mother, had been asked to lead a new department, Director of Human Development. Her title was strange on her tongue, but her work was clear. She walked the halls with authority now, not a mop. She led the Hidden Currents Project, a program designed for the unseen: janitors, cleaners, delivery workers, cafeteria staff. They were no longer background. They were recognized as currents carrying the whole river forward. And from that program came the Bridge Builder Scholarship Fund. Its first brochure bore James's rules in simple type: never guess, ask again. Translate meaning, not just words. Respect before speed. Listen for what the heart is saying. Beneath the rules was the new motto that had spread far beyond the tower: bridge builders, not gatekeepers. James himself had returned to Redridge after that winter, not to escape, but to plant something new. The old library, with its cracked plaster and crooked shelves, had given him his first book of ASL. Now it became the place where he taught others. At first, only 3 children came: 2 brothers whose father drove long-haul trucks, and a girl whose grandmother had gone deaf. They sat on mismatched chairs, their breath visible in the cold air, while James showed them the signs for thank you, patience, and respect. Word spread. By spring, the room was full. Farmers after chores, mothers with toddlers, even the retired postman, all learning to move their hands in a language that had once made James invisible and now made him a guide. On the wall above the chalkboard, he had written the sentence Catherine had first inscribed in the draft contract. Respect is the first word of every language. He made the children copy it at the top of every page. The letters from Cedarline continued. Catherine sent updates on the contract: drivers receiving safe delay bonuses, farmers accessing live data dashboards, grievances resolved within hours instead of months. The Respect Ledger was real, published weekly for the world to read. Moreira wrote too, in long flowing Libras translated by his aide. He told James that Brazil had adopted similar clauses with other firms, and that the phrase dual veto was now common vocabulary in agritech contracts. "The machine stops when dignity bends," he signed. "That is your legacy already." James never thought of it as his. He thought of it as soil, seeds planted by many hands, watered by respect. One evening, near sunset, James sat on the porch of his uncle's farmhouse, the old wooden boards creaking beneath his boots. His mother brought him tea in a chipped mug. "You've grown quiet again," she said, sitting beside him. He smiled faintly. "Quiet feels different now, not like before." "How so?" "Before, it was invisible. Now, it's listening." She reached out, brushed his hair back. "You remind me of your father when you say things like that. He used to tell me silence was how the earth spoke." James's eyes softened. He had few memories of his father, only fragments. But tonight, the thought felt like a warm lantern in the dusk. Summer came. The Bridge Builder Scholarship announced its first recipients: 3 children from janitor and farm worker families headed to schools that had once felt unreachable. At the ceremony, Catherine invited James to speak. He stood on the stage awkwardly, still small in his patched sweater despite the honor. Cameras flashed, but he ignored them. He opened his notebook, looked down at the first page, then closed it again. "I don't have many words," he said softly. "But I know this. A bridge is strongest when it's walked by many feet. Thank you for walking with me." The applause was warm, steady, Not for spectacle, but for something older, like gratitude itself. Later, as the bus rumbled back through the dark fields toward Redridge, James sat by the window. The sky was wide and starlit, the kind of sky that swallowed the noise of cities. He touched the cover of his notebook, worn soft from use, and remembered the day he had first raised his hands in the boardroom of Cedarline Tower. He remembered Pike's sneer, Catherine's defense, Morera's tears, and the sentence that had begun it all. Respect is the first word of every language. He whispered it once to himself, then traced the sign for respect against the cold glass. That night, before sleep, he added one final line to his notebook. Empires do not collapse only because of storms or markets. They collapse when they forget to see the unseen. And sometimes, it takes one farm boy to remind them. He set down his pencil, closed the book, and lay back with a small, quiet smile. The farm was still poor. The county was still small. But the bridge was real, and it stretched farther than even the boy from Redridge could see. And somewhere in the silence, the Empire listened.